My brother-in-law was still smiling when I walked through the front door. That smile disappeared so fast I almost heard it leave the room. I don't sleep well on long drives, never have. So when I pulled into the driveway of my parents' new place at 6:30 in the morning after 9 hours on the road, I was running on gas station coffee and something I couldn't quite name yet, something that had been building since the missed calls started 2 nights before. 3 from my mom, 1 from my dad, no voicemails. That last part was what scared me. I should back up. My parents have been married for 52 years. My dad, Gene, worked 31 years at a paper mill in rural Ohio. My mom, Harriet, cleaned houses 3 days a week until her knees gave out, and then she took in ironing. They are not wealthy people. They are not people who have ever expected anything from anyone. What they are, what they have always been, is steady. The kind of steady that takes a lifetime to build and a single afternoon to break. I'm their youngest. I have one older brother, Darren. Darren is 44. I'm 31. We are not close. We haven't been close since I was maybe 15 and started noticing the way he talked to our parents, like they were inconveniences, like their needs were interruptions to his actual life. He moved to Phoenix with his wife Thompson 12 years ago, and for a long time that distance felt like a gift to everyone involved, even if nobody said it out loud. I went a different direction. I stayed near home through college, got a degree in accounting, and spent the first few years of my career doing exactly what I was supposed to do. Building credit, paying down my student loans, learning how money actually works instead of how it's supposed to work in theory. I took a job at a mid-sized firm in Columbus, got promoted twice before I was 28, and somewhere in the middle of all that I made a decision. I was going to buy my parents a house. Not because they asked, they would never ask. That's not who they are. But I had watched them rent the same 2-bedroom place outside Zanesville for 19 years, watched my dad renegotiate the lease every year with his hat in his hand, watched my mom go quiet whenever the topic of retirement came up. They had nothing to show for their lives except their lives themselves, and I thought they deserved something solid, something that belonged to them in a way that couldn't be taken back. I spent 14 months saving and planning. I worked with a buyer's agent named Colleen who specialized in rural properties, and we found a place about 40 minutes outside of Columbus, a 3-bedroom craftsman on just over an acre, updated kitchen, screened porch off the back, and a garden bed along the south side of the property where my mom could grow her tomatoes. The asking price was $318,000. After inspection credits and negotiation, we closed at $344,500. I put down 20% in cash and took a mortgage for the rest, with the deed in my name and my parents listed as lifetime tenants with full rights of occupancy. That last part matters. I'll come back to it. I told my parents 3 weeks before closing. My mom sat at their kitchen table and covered her mouth with both hands and didn't make a sound for almost a full minute. My dad walked to the window and stood there with his back to me and his shoulders shaking, and when he finally turned around his eyes were red and he said, "You didn't have to do this, Laurel." I told him I knew that. I told him that was the whole point. We moved them in on a Saturday in September. My mom brought her good dishes in a laundry basket wrapped in dish towels. My dad brought his tools. By sundown, they were standing on the screened porch watching fireflies come up out of the yard, and my mom had already decided where the tomatoes were going. That was 8 months ago. I called them every Sunday. They sounded good, better than good. My dad had found a neighbor 2 doors down who needed help fixing a truck, and they'd become something like friends. My mom had planted her garden and joined a church quilting circle. They were, for the first time in as long as I could remember, resting. They had stopped bracing. Then the Sunday calls stopped returning. The first one I missed, I didn't think much about. The second one I told myself they were busy. After the third, I called my dad's cell directly and got voicemail. After the fourth, something shifted in my chest, a tightening, low, and specific, the kind of feeling I've learned not to argue with. I texted my mom, "Is everything okay? Call me when you can." Nothing for 6 hours. Then, "We're fine, honey. Just a lot going on." I knew my mother's, "We're fine." I'd heard it my whole life. It meant the opposite. I left Columbus at 9:30 on a Thursday night. What I didn't know, and what I would piece together over the next 36 hours, was this: Darren and Tamsin had driven up from Phoenix 8 days earlier. They'd told my parents it was a visit, a surprise visit, Tamsin's idea. She'd always wanted to see Ohio in the spring. My parents had been happy, apparently. Genuinely happy. Darren didn't visit often. The first 2 days were fine. Then Tamsin started rearranging things. Small things at first. Moving furniture, reorganizing the kitchen cabinets, replacing the curtains my mom had just hung with ones she brought from Phoenix in a bag. My mom said something gentle and Tamsin said she was just trying to help. Darren said, "Let her, Mom, it's fine." My dad went quiet the way he always goes quiet when he doesn't know how to push back without it turning into something. By the 4th day, Darren had taken the second bedroom as an office. He'd set up his monitor and his router and told my parents he was going to be working remotely for a while. Tamsin had put a lock on the outside of the laundry room door. When my mom asked why, Tamsin said she needed a space for her things. When my dad asked how long a while meant, Darren said he hadn't decided yet. I'm going to tell you something about the house that becomes important here. I had never shown Darren the deed. He knew I'd bought the place. He knew my parents were living there. He did not know exactly how the title was structured, and apparently at some point during those 8 days, he had started operating on the assumption that what I had done was purchase a property, put it in my parents' names, and then step back. That my parents owned it. That they could, if they chose to, allow their son to live there indefinitely, or to make decisions about how it was used. What he did not know, what he was about to find out, was that the deed had my name on it. Mine alone. My parents were tenants with full occupancy rights, protected under Ohio tenant law, but they were not owners. I had done it that way deliberately, on the advice of an estate attorney, specifically to protect the property from situations exactly like this one. Family members assuming access, creditors, Medicaid look-back windows down the road. I had thought ahead. I had paid someone to help me think ahead. Darren had not thought ahead at all. I found out the worst part on the phone with my mom at 2 a.m, pulled over at a rest stop in Licking County with my hazards on. She was whispering. She whispered because Darren and Tamsin were asleep 20 feet away in what used to be her guest room. She told me that the day before, while my dad was at his neighbor's place, Darren had asked her to sign something. He presented it casually, across the kitchen table with coffee, like it was nothing. It was a document. She didn't fully understand it, she said. She didn't have her reading glasses and she felt rushed, but from what she could tell, it was some kind of permission form, something about allowing him to act on her behalf regarding the property. She had signed it. She hadn't told my dad because she didn't want him to worry. I sat in that rest stop parking lot for a long time. I wasn't panicking. That surprised me. I expected to panic, and instead I felt something go very still inside me, the way a room goes still just before you have to say something that changes everything. I thought about my mom's hands shaking on the phone. I thought about my dad not knowing. I thought about Tamsin's curtains hanging in my mother's windows. I pulled back onto the highway. I got there at 6:22 in the morning. I know because I looked at my phone when I turned off the engine, and I sat in the car for 4 minutes before I went in, just long enough to make sure I was composed. I had stopped at a Walmart outside Columbus the night before and bought a box of my mom's favorite tea, a half-dozen eggs, and a small tin of the Danish butter cookies she always kept on the counter at Christmas. I don't know why. Muscle memory, maybe. Something about wanting to walk in with something useful in my hands. The front door was unlocked. My mom was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug. She looked up when I came in and the expression on her face broke something in me. Relief and shame at the same time, like she had been caught needing help. I put the bag down and crossed the kitchen and hugged her and she said, very quietly, into my shoulder, "I'm sorry, Laurel." I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. My dad came down the hallway a few minutes later in his robe, stopped when he saw me and said, "Oh, thank God." He'd heard from my mom what was happening but hadn't said anything to Darren yet because he didn't know what to say or what would happen when he did. My dad is 73 years old. He worked his whole life. He should not, at 73, be standing in his own kitchen rehearsing how to talk to his son. I had brought my laptop. I had also, before I left Columbus, emailed myself several documents, a PDF of the deed, a copy of the occupancy agreement, a scan of the estate attorney's letter outlining the ownership structure, and a 2-paragraph summary I had written myself, clearly, for exactly this kind of conversation. I'd had it for months. I'd hoped I would never need it. Darren came downstairs at 8:15. Tamsin was behind him. He was in gym shorts and a t-shirt, and he clearly had not expected to see me standing in the kitchen. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and said, "Laurel, what are you doing here?" I said, "I came to see Mom and Dad." He looked at my mom. She looked at her mug. He said, "It's a long drive, you should have called." I said, "I tried." There was a moment of quiet. Tamsin went to the coffee maker. Darren crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, and I could see him calculating, measuring, deciding which version of this conversation he wanted to have. He chose the friendly version first. He said he and Tamsin were just helping out, that Mom and Dad were getting older, and it made more sense for family to be nearby, that he'd been meaning to connect with me about a longer-term plan for the property, that it was a lot for me to manage from Columbus. Then maybe we could work something out. I let him finish. Then I opened my laptop. I pulled up the deed and turned the screen so he could see it. I said, "The property is in my name. Mom and Dad have full occupancy rights as tenants, which means they have the legal right to live here without interference. It also means that any document purporting to grant someone else authority over this property signed by a tenant, not an owner, is not legally valid." I watched his face change. He said, "What?" I said, "I own this house, Darren, not Mom and Dad. They live here. You do not." Tamsin turned around from the coffee maker. Darren said, "You can't just. That's not how this works, Laurel. They're our parents." I said, "They are, and they live here, in their home, and they've told me they feel uncomfortable. That's enough for me." He started to raise his voice then, not quite shouting, but the register that's meant to intimidate, the one he'd been using on our parents for 30 years. He said I was being ridiculous, that I was treating this like a business transaction, that I didn't understand what it meant to be present for your family, that he'd been here for 8 days while I was off in Columbus being too busy to check in. I didn't raise my voice back. I said, "I've been checking in every Sunday for 8 months. The calls stopped getting returned 8 days ago, which is when you arrived. I'd like you and Tamsin to pack your things today." My dad, who had been standing quietly near the refrigerator, said, "Darren, she asked you to leave." I don't know if I had ever heard my dad say something like that to Darren before. It was so quiet and so final that the room just held it for a second. Darren tried one more angle. He brought up the document my mom had signed. He said she had given him permission to act on her behalf regarding the property. I asked him to show it to me. He went upstairs and came back with a printed form. It was a general authorization letter, the kind you can find online for free, notarized, not filed with any court, and granting authority over property matters in language vague enough to be meaningless. I looked at it for about 15 seconds. I said, "This isn't a power of attorney. It's notarized, it wasn't drafted by an attorney, and it was signed by a tenant, not a property owner. It has no legal effect on this property." I said it the same way I would explain a tax discrepancy to a client, even. Clear, not unkind, but not soft either. Tamsin said, "You're going to make us leave after we drove all the way here?" I said, "You're welcome to visit. I'd love for you to visit. But you can't live here without my knowledge and against my parents' comfort. And you can't sign things at my mother's kitchen table and call it permission." They left that afternoon. It took 4 hours, which included one more round of Darren trying to relitigate the conversation in the driveway, while my dad stood on the porch and my mom watched from the kitchen window. I stood by my car and I let him talk, and when he was done I said, "Drive safe." He didn't respond. Tamsin got in the passenger seat without looking at me. After they pulled out, I went back inside and my mom was sitting at the table again, and there was a plate on the counter. She had put out some of the butter cookies I'd brought. I sat down across from her and we each had one, and she told me, without me asking, the whole story from the beginning. The curtains, the lock on the laundry room door, the document slid across the table with coffee. She cried a little at that part and I didn't rush her. My dad came in from the porch and pulled a chair up to the table, and the three of us sat there for a long time in the quiet of a house that was theirs again. I called my estate attorney from the driveway before I left the next morning. Not because anything legally urgent had changed, but because I wanted it noted that Darren had presented a fraudulent authorization document to a tenant of the property. She said she documented in the file and suggested we consider sending a formal letter, which I authorized. It went out the following week. Darren never responded to it. What happened after that was quieter than I expected. Darren called me once, about 3 weeks later. He said he was sorry things had gotten heated. He did not say he was sorry for any of the things he had done. I said I appreciated him calling. I told him the door was open to visit if he wanted to do that differently. He said he'd think about it. He hasn't called back. My mom texted me the following month to tell me the tomatoes were coming in. She sent a picture. I saved it. I think about what Darren said in the driveway, that I was treating it like a business transaction. He meant it as an insult. But here's what I've come to understand. Taking care of people you love requires you to think ahead. It requires paperwork and planning and conversations that feel awkward to have. It requires you to know the difference between a general authorization letter and a valid power of attorney. It requires you to not assume that love is enough protection on its own, because love does not appear on a deed. My parents are not naive people. They are trusting people. Those are different things, and it took me a while to understand that protecting them didn't mean shielding them from hard truths. It meant making sure that when hard truths arrived, there was a structure in place that could hold. Last month, I drove out on a Saturday morning and we sat on the screened porch with my mom's good coffee and watched the light change over the yard. My dad pointed out a red-tailed hawk that had been circling the field behind the fence. My mom had a quilt folded over her lap that she was still finishing. Nobody was bracing for anything. A house is just a building. What you put inside it, the steadiness, the safety, the particular quiet of people who finally feel like they can stop waiting for something to go wrong. That's the part money can't buy. But I'll be honest with you, the paperwork doesn't hurt. I keep coming back to the image of my mom's hands around that mug, the way she looked up when I walked in. Not quite relief. Not quite shame. Something in between that I don't have a clean word for. She said, "I'm sorry, Laurel," and I told her she had nothing to be sorry for, and I meant it completely, but I also understood in that moment what had made her vulnerable in the first place. She trusted because that's who she is. She signed because she didn't want conflict. She went quiet because she'd spent a lifetime keeping the peace, and keeping the peace had cost her something real this time. That's not a character flaw. That's what happens when good people haven't been given the tools to protect themselves. And I think about that a lot. The difference between being a good person and being a prepared one. My parents are both. Darren is neither, or at least he chose not to be that day, but the document he slid across the table with coffee, casual as a grocery list, that didn't happen because he's a monster. It happened because he assumed nobody had thought ahead. He assumed the structure was soft. He was wrong, but only because I had spent months making sure he would be. That's the part I want people to sit with. Not the confrontation in the kitchen, not the moment he drove away, but the 14 months before any of it happened, the conversations with the estate attorney, the way the deed was structured, the occupancy agreement that made my parents' rights explicit and protected. None of that was exciting. None of it made a good story at the time. It was just careful, unglamorous work that turned out to matter enormously when it needed to. I think resilience gets talked about like it's something you feel in the moment, gritting your teeth, holding your ground, not crying in front of the person trying to intimidate you. And yes, some of it is that, but most of it is the work you do when nothing is on fire yet. It's the hard conversation you have with yourself about what could go wrong and what you're going to do about it. It's deciding that love is not enough protection on its own, and then doing something about that decision. My dad said she asked you to leave in a voice so quiet it barely moved the air. He is 73 years old and he worked his whole life and he has never been a man who raises his voice. What he did in that moment wasn't loud, but it was one of the most morally clear things I have ever witnessed. He knew what was right. He said it. That's the whole thing, really. Knowing what's right and saying it out loud, even when the person in front of you is your own son. I'm not telling this story because it ended well for me. I'm telling it because the ending was a direct result of choices made quietly, early, without any audience. The paperwork, the planning, the refusal to assume that because something is family, it's safe. My parents are on that screen porch right now, most likely. My dad watching the field, my mom with her quilt. Nobody bracing. That's what doing things right looks like from the outside. It looks like nothing at all.